It's always dangerous when the introduction is longer than my scheduled talk. I don't know if I can live up to those wonderful words, Nate. Thank you so much. I want to thank all of you, first of all, for coming tonight, and I especially want to thank the Board of Trustees of the university for the wonderful opportunity they've given me to serve the state through this role. It's both a privilege and an honor. I also want to give my thanks to Dean Rutherford for the opportunity to engage in this conversation this evening. Today is my 10th day on the job, and Dean Rutherford suggested to me that I might want to comment on my plans for the university over the next 2 decades. I thought 10 days is probably not enough time to formulate concrete plans. But I do want to talk about the university in its most plural sense today, and the role that it might play in Arkansas and our future over those next 2 decades. And I'm going to start off by telling a little story, humorous story hopefully, about a dean and a provost, because as was mentioned, I came here from a position of a provost. And the story goes like this. A new dean was hired and had been in a role several weeks, and came out to her car one day and she found a parking ticket. Well, you know, deans are much too busy to be fooling around with parking tickets. She marched into the provost's office, slammed it down on the assistant's desk and said, you know, I'm a dean, new dean, I have important things to do academically, and there's no way I can be messing around with a parking ticket. And the assistant to the provost was visibly upset and teared up a little bit and said, I don't know how to tell you this, but the provost is dead. Well, the dean picked up the parking ticket and stormed out of the office. Deans are not very patient individuals, and so about 10 minutes later, she came in again, same routine, slammed the ticket down, said, I need this taken care of, I need it taken care of now. Well, this really upset the assistant. She said, the provost passed away last night in his sleep, and he's not here, he's dead. She picked up the ticket again and stormed out. 10 minutes later, came in, same exact routine, and by now, the assistant is visibly upset, starts to cry and says, I don't know how to tell you this, but the provost is dead, the provost is dead, the provost is dead. And with that, a smile curled up on the dean's face, and she said, I know, but I just wanted to hear you say it one more time. Now, actually, I have a very good relationship with Dean Rutherford. But I tell you that because this tells you a little bit about the hierarchy in higher education, and the fact that that hierarchy has not changed in a very long time. And there always seems to be this tension that exists within the organization. That tension goes back a very long time. In fact, if you go to Charleston, South Carolina, to the Old Town District, you will see a small little room with bars in front of it, and it's labeled Provost Dungeon. And it tells you a little bit, there's actually a purpose to that. It tells you that much of what we do in higher education, from the way we teach, to the administrative structure that we use to carry out its mission, has been in place for hundreds of years, and perhaps maybe even 1,000 years, going all the way back to the formation of Oxford and Cambridge. And so the question then becomes, is that structure appropriate for the challenges that are facing higher education, both within the state of Arkansas and indeed across the nation and maybe even the globe? So what I would like to do today is lay out the case, first of all, for supporting a robust, inclusive, comprehensive, and indeed cost-effective system of higher education in the state. I'd like to offer some insight into the advantages that accrue to the individual and to the state, if indeed we can meet that lofty goal. And then I want to talk a little bit about the challenges that are facing higher education, and I'm going to use an example from the steel industry, because it's important to learn from others' mistakes or history so that one does not repeat them. And once I've sort of laid out that and scared you as I am scared sometimes at night, I often ask people what keeps you up at night, and what I'm talking about keeps me up at night. I want to talk a little bit about how technology might be a way, if we can mend it and mold it into the institution, to help us educate more students in a cost-effective manner better than we are right now. Now, before I begin, I want to talk about a few things. And when I talk about technology, I talk about online education, I want to talk about the fact of what it is and what it is not. Online education encompasses a wider range of technologies. It can be education in which people are taught using technology in a classroom in a seat-to-seat fashion. Face-to-face is what we call. It could be remote. A person could be halfway around the globe and receiving instruction. Or it can be a hybrid of the two, in which we use online and technology to enhance the educational experience in the classroom. The quality issue, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this because it rears its head frequently, I think has been addressed very recently with two reports that were issued, one from the Department of Education, the U.S. government, and the other from APLU, which is the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities. Both of them looked at online education, distance education, and came to the same conclusion. There are some students who benefit from face-to-face instruction. I have a son that Nate knows who that's absolutely it. If you can't get out of bed in the morning, you're not going to turn on the computer and take your class. So there are definitely some students, and there are other advantages that accrue to being in a face-to-face situation. The role of mentors, the socialization that occurs on a college campus. And we'll talk about that. But at the same time, there are other students who benefit quite dramatically from the online experience because they're time or space bound and cannot make it to a campus. They have family responsibilities. There are other things that are impediments to their ability to carry out a traditional college experience. So the quality issue has been addressed because when these studies looked at this, their conclusion was very simple. For students who are properly motivated, the learning outcomes, the performance, if you will, of the students, is identical between the two formats, that is, in a face-to-face versus an online. And what online education is it's not a videotape of a talking head of someone who already did a lecture. Okay? I've had a number of those boring experiences, and that is not online. And as an experience, as an example, I had the privilege of watching Dr. Michael Moore, who was a faculty member at UT Arlington and a winner of the equivalent of a Grammy in online education. His course is a very dramatic and dynamic experience. He does American political systems. He might be talking about decisions of the government and be bringing in links and other types of media to encompass the experience. He has blogs that are ongoing. If, for example, they're talking about Roe versus Wade, they might have film of the original decision being rendered. And then on the online blogs, they have students who comment on it. And I can tell you two things about online education. One, we know a lot more about our students online than we do in the classroom. A lot more. I can tell you, for example, that student spent 7 seconds on Module 7. Got through it as quickly as they could so they could take the quiz. I can tell you who's read the material and how many times they went back over it. I also will tell you on the blogs, that is in the communications, because of the anonymity of the internet, people are more likely to be honest, and so you may have a student comment on how Roe versus Wade affected them individually. Or in one case, we had one of our students who was deployed in Iraq commenting on the war and the values that society places over there in the Middle East on their experiences there. And it was a very dramatic experience that enriched the learning environment for all the students who were participating at that time. So online education can be every bit or even more so enriching than a face-to-face if done well. And I won't come back and touch on that again, but I did want people to understand that we're not talking about a videotape of someone who's given a lecture and then playing it back at some time more convenient for a student. So let's talk a little bit about the value of a college degree. What does it mean? Well, what we hope when students come to our institutions, we hope that they obviously leave with content. I mean, obviously, we want our engineers to understand stresses and forces, and I'm sure of that every time I drive on 430 across the river. But there's also soft skills that are transmitted in our educational experience that are becoming increasingly important in society. And if you think about the things that we do, we develop their abilities to communicate effectively, oral and written word. We talk about the ability to develop critical thinking skills, and I'll have something to say about that in a minute. And we also talk about the need to develop cultural awareness and sensitivity. In our increasingly heterogeneous society, it's pretty clear that individuals are going to work in communities where the individuals that they're working with look different than they do. All those are things we can do very well at our institutions of higher education. Now, I think society is recognizing that also, and just as a matter of fact, many jobs that particularly that in the past did not require a college education now do. In the community I just left, you cannot be a police officer without at least a 2-year degree. You cannot become anything other than a patrol person unless you have a master's degree. If you want to be a fire person, you need a college degree. Why is that so? Well, every fire is a potential crime scene. And if you want to be a flight attendant for American Airlines, you need a college degree. And I think the events of 9/11 have convinced us that what occurs in that confined cabin is very complex, and decisions have to be made very quickly and made correctly. So a college degree is valuable. I mentioned that it accrues advantages to the individual and accrues advantages to society. The other thing we need to think about, though, is that others have the same idea. And our competition isn't within the state of Arkansas. In fact, it's really not even within the United States of America. In 2009, U.S. Chamber reports that the United States accounted for about 25% of the economic activity in the world. The prediction by the same chamber is that by the year 2050, we will only account for about 11%. And in fact, that 11% represents about the level of the third world economies at the present time. Now, it's not that we're going to fail, it's that others want what we have. And they see education as the ticket to get to that level. China and India have about 2.4 billion people. That's about 8 times what we have. Their economy, that is China's, grew by 10 times since 1993. It's 1,000%. India's economy has grown by 7% a year in spite of the recession. India has 12 million in college right now, and they want to have 72 million in college by the year 2015. China is spending billions of dollars to create, in their words, 20 MITs. And they have a program called 1,000 Points of Light that some of you may have heard of. They're bringing back American academics, Chinese nationals, who have done stellar in their careers. They're giving them very, very competitive salaries and lots of startup money to bring their ideas and eventually their companies home to China. So when I say that the competition is global, it truly is global. Recently, in Texas, we had on campus Thomas Friedman, New York Times columnist, wrote 2 books. One of them is called The World is Flat, you're probably familiar with. The other was Flat, Hot, and Crowded, if I remember the other title. The other person we had on campus very recently was Richard Florida. He's coined the term creative class, studies why some communities are thriving and some are not. And both of them came up with a statistic that I remembered in our conversations that I found fairly consistent, amazingly, and also very appropriate to this conversation. Both of them say that by the year 2025, 1/2 to 2/3 of all the jobs will require some post-secondary credential. 50% of the jobs that will exist in the year 2018 do not exist at the present time. So when I talk about what we develop in a college experience and we talk about critical thinking skills, remember, you can't train someone for a job that doesn't exist. And so we have to be able to create students who can graduate and are adaptive and have the thinking skills to be able to move into new technologies as they come their way. You think about how fast society is changing. I used to date movies by the cars that were in them. Now I do it by the cell phones. I saw one the other day, which is probably no more than about 10 or 12 years old, and it looked like General Patton's field phone the individual was holding. I'm amazed at the forearms that individual took. Closer to home, there was recently a study reported by the state of Georgia, and their numbers are really pretty consistent too. In the state of Georgia, they assume that 60% of the jobs in 2020 will require either an associate or bachelor's degree, but in 2011, only 42% of their citizens have such a credential. Now, I want to give you some comparisons, so I looked it up. Japan and Canada have 56% of their population have that credential, and South Korea, a very formidable economic competitor, is at 63%. So one approach that's been suggested is, well, we segment things in this country. You know, Detroit used to be, maybe it is again, where we make cars, and films and entertainment is best produced in California, and maybe financials in New York. Why don't we farm out degree production to those that can do it cheaper and better than maybe we can or anyone else? Well, I caution to take that approach for a number of reasons, because we are here to serve the citizens in a state. But if you use an example of Rice University, Rice University, by statute, can only have 15% of their freshman class come from the county Rice is located in, 15%. But if you look at the zip codes of their alumni base, 30% live in that county. So I would suggest that if we farm it out, what we're probably doing is sending our best and brightest to other states to drive their economies, not our own. So we've talked about the value of a college degree. Let's talk a little bit about university structures, because I think this is where there's some opportunity for improvement. If you think about the university nowadays, we offer semesters based upon an agrarian calendar. Now, I talk about this to students. By that I mean we begin classes in August and we end them in May. And so I ask students, okay, how many are actively engaged in farming? And pretty much no one raises their hand anymore. But yet we haven't changed. And that agrarian calendar has been in place for probably at least 200 years. You know, we offer content in 2 long semesters, one beginning in August, one September, I've mentioned. When we have a shortened summer term, we kind of do summer. You know, we give it a little bit of effort, but not a great deal of effort. Our semesters and our courses are designed in 15-week blocks of time. So special about 15 weeks. The material is presented linearly. What that means is if you miss a concept in my discipline, chemistry, you're in serious trouble come the final, because everything from that point on drives from the concept that you missed. And I think that's one of the reasons why people have so much problems in mathematics in college, because everything builds upon what came before it. And if you think about the possibilities, we orient the material, the rate, and everything we do in a classroom around sort of the middle of the class. And those that are struggling, it's very difficult to help get them up to the middle of the class. And of course, those that are bored are just sitting there doing nothing and really could be working on more advanced material. But we have to do that because we're managing this in blocks of 20 or 50, or in my case, teaching general chemistry, 300. And we have to manage this 15-week semester that way. As we'll talk about when we get to online and we get to alternative modes of instructional delivery, none of these constraints really limit us anymore. You know, the other thing that really occurs to me, but probably beyond the course of this conversation, is the fact that we almost charge just about the same amount for every student, independent of what they're doing. Now, I grant you there's some small exceptions, and we have little add-ons if you're in, I don't know, nursing, because there's some clinical aspects to it. But the first point is that we charge about the same amount. And I ask myself often, is this logical? And here I have a thought question for you. If Toyota adopted the same pricing strategy, my guess is that all the Lexus are going to be cleared out of the lot before a single Corolla is sold. Well, that's a whole other conversation. So there's some challenges ahead. Okay, we've talked about sort of the state of the art, what we do at a university. What are the challenges ahead? Well, if you take a look at the federal budget, I don't think anyone can see very much in the way of good news for higher education. It's just the way it is. Pell Grants, which are the basis for how many students, particularly at the lower economic levels, fund their college education, are going to be flat, we're hoping, but may indeed be cut. Guaranteed student loans are now limited to undergraduates. And they're talking about capping the amounts because of debt. You can see this no matter where you look. There was actually an article in today's Chronicle of Higher Education, and here's the title: Colleges Fear Tough Budget News from Congressional Supercommittee. So I think at the federal level, I think our hope is that things will be relatively flat. But of course, that may not even come true. State budgets are really stretched. You know, there's many needs, but flat revenue projections. And just as an example, what's happened in higher education in the state of Texas, which I'm most familiar with, over the past 10 years, the support for the institution I came from went from 50% state appropriations to about 20 in just a decade. So, you know, the U.S. economy is improving, but not at a rate that I think is going to affect families to the point where we can raise, or nor should we raise, tuition appreciably, even though some states have. Stephen Moore was recently in Little Rock. He's the senior economic writer for the Wall Street Journal. And I grabbed a couple statistics from him because Dean Rutherford suggested I ought to for this talk, and it was good advice. But he looked at the Consumer Price Index over the past decade and looked at the percent change. And here's some numbers, startling numbers. Computers have actually decreased in cost by 76%. Okay? Apparel, 6%. Even new vehicles, 5%. Medical care, 44%. Energy, 50%. Education, 70%. Probably not likely we can raise tuition to supplement deficiencies in state appropriations. So these are the realities of the situation. I'm not trying to overemphasize the point. One approach has been taken, just to kind of give you the realm of what people are looking at out there, is to bring in more out-of-state students paying out-of-state rates or international students. And we did that in the past. But our competitors have figured it out also. I just recently heard Tony Blair from UK and John Howard from Australia. Both of them at the countrywide level have the influx, or use the influx of international students, mostly from China, to help support their institutions of higher education. UC Berkeley now actively recruits 25% of their freshman class from outside the state of California. That would have been unheard of just a few years ago. And that's because those out-of-state rates, higher tuition, cover the costs of deficiencies that are occurring in the institutional funding from the state. And the last thing that creates challenges for us is that student demographics are changing. There's absolutely no doubt about it. The average age that students are in our institutions of higher education is increasing for a variety of reasons. Many of them have to work to go to school. That contributes to their age. There's family responsibilities that go with increasing age, and we have a large influx of veterans who are returning and need to be reacclimated into society, and in fact, hopefully, will be able to use the benefits of their GI Bill to attend college. So there's a lot of challenges we face, and students today have more choices than we ever could imagine. They're going to get to decide when, where, and maybe even what they learn. So I wanted you to just kind of see the landscape of what keeps me up at night, probably keeps a lot of you up also. But all is not lost, because there are some exciting things going on that give us hope that indeed we can meet these challenges. Before I go on, I wanted to just mention two individuals, and if you have a chance, I'd be glad to email anyone these names. But if you have the opportunity and you haven't seen some of the work of Dr. Michael Wesch, W-E-S-C-H, from Kansas State University, if you want to see what technology can mean in a learning environment, this gentleman really has it down pat. And the other one is Mr. Sal Khan. Some of you may know the Khan Academies, K-A-H-M. You can really gain an appreciation for, if you Google these two and look at some of their work, to see how technology is really changing the educational experience and changing it in that rapid pace that we talk about and all the other things that are occurring in society. So in order for me to sort of get a handle on this, I always like to look for other examples. And I recently heard Professor Clayton Christensen, who's a distinguished professor in the Harvard Business School, talk a little bit. Now, Professor Christensen, I'm going to parallel his exact lecture, so I must be careful to attribute it to him. But it was one of the most stimulating hours that I had spent in a long time, and that includes listening to my own lectures in chemistry. He wrote a book, some of you may know it, it's called The Innovative University, Changing the DNA of Higher Education from the Inside Out. Always better to change it from the inside out rather than the outside in. And he wrote it with Henry Eyring, to sort of give you the Cliff Notes version, because we don't have a lot of time today about this, what he studies, Professor Christensen studies, are industry leaders, and then he looks at them a decade later, and he found a startling statistic. Most of them were at best in the middle of the pack of their industry 1 decade later, and many of them were in bankruptcy. This was intriguing. What drives industry leaders to sort of go downhill so quickly? Because a decade is not, much time. And here's his conclusion. I'm going to give you the real Cliff Notes so you don't have to read 300 some odd pages, but here's how it goes, and I quote, "Rarely does someone beat them head to head. Rather, the new competition comes in at the bottom and offers a simpler, more affordable product, allowing more people to participate." Let me repeat that. If I'm going to paraphrase Dr. Christensen, rarely will we get beat in head-to-head competition. Rather, someone's going to come in at the bottom, and they're going to offer a new product that's simpler, more affordable, and it allows more people to participate. Okay? So that's kind of his warning to us. So this is a characteristic of what he terms replacers, disruptive technologies that can come in, boom, just flatten the landscape and take off. And his example for all of us to kind of learn from is the steel industry. Now, I grew up in Pennsylvania where the steel industry used to be king and then sort of disappeared. And so this had kind of a personal effect on me because I saw this happen and didn't understand why. But here's in a nutshell what has happened. There's really only two ways to produce steel. There's the integrated mills, and they dominated since the 1800s. These are huge footprint entities. If you're going to replace one right now, it will cost $10 billion. They can produce all kinds of steel, all kinds of different products at all kinds of levels of quality, but they are pretty limited in what they can take in. They need a fairly refined ore. What happened in the 70s is someone came up with an idea called a mini mill. Mini mill is such that, if I understand the scale properly, you could probably put at least 4 of them in the building that we're in right now. Maybe not in the room, but in the building. They can operate at 20% lower cost than the integrated mill. They produce a pretty low quality product, at least initially, but they can take all kinds of different inputs, for example, even recycled materials. So there are 4 steel products that society was interested in. Rebar, which is, that's what goes into concrete to help reinforce it. It's low quality, low profit, not very sophisticated to make. Then there's angle iron, structural steel, and finally sheet metal goes into cars. That's the highest profit, most sophisticated. It really is a triumph of metallurgy to produce high-quality sheet steel. And so what happened? The mini mills came in the 70s, and they looked at the array of things, and they've got to get educated. So they started making rebar. Well, the integrated mills looked at rebar, and they said, that's a really low-quality product. We really don't want to be making rebar. We'll just let the mini mills have it. And in fact, after about 4 or 5 years of this, the mini mills kind of took over the market. In fact, the price maintained itself until the last integrated mill went out of the rebar market. At that point in time, the cost or price of rebar plummeted. Boom, 20%. Who could have predicted that? And guess what happened? Well, the mini mills said, we got to survive, and so we'll improve, we'll become more efficient, we'll make a higher quality product. Well, the product goes into concrete, and there's fundamental limits to how efficient you can get. And so what did they do? What would you do? Well, I think I'd look up the profit stream and see what's next on the line. And so they started making angle iron. Of course, the integrated mills said, angle iron's not very profitable for us. We're going to let the mini mills have it, and we're going to go on and just make structural steel and sheet metal. And the mini mills did, and the price of angle iron maintained itself until the last integrated mill dropped out. And then the price of angle iron plummeted 20%. And guess where the mini mills look next? That's right, structural steel. And when they were done with structural steel, they looked at sheet metal. And so if you look at the case in 2011, what's the situation in the steel industry? All but one integrated mill in the United States has now been driven into bankruptcy. And the mini mills now control 65% of the steel business worldwide. 65%. I'd say that's market penetration. So are there other examples, just like a single thing? Well, I used the example of Toyota earlier. I'm old enough to remember when Toyota came to the United States. They produced a little product called the Corona, if I remember correctly. I think I had a relative who had one. Not a very reliable car, kind of rusty, but you know what? Toyota learned. And so after they produced the Corona, they came out with the Tercel, a little bit better car, than the Corolla, Camry, Avalon, and then the Lexus brand. And if it weren't for a significant natural event over in Japan, they were the largest car company in the world. So what Professor Christensen is trying to tell us is learn from these types of examples. And he's suggesting that online education has the potential to be that disruptive technology. Now, someone's already figured this out. Actually, many people have figured this out. And they're attempting to make a profit, because let's face it, higher education is a big money industry, propagated it worldwide. The University of Phoenix enrolls 30,000 students per month in their programs, 30,000 per month. I just went and looked up the revenues today before I came over here, $3.8 billion last year, $3.8 billion. And let me tell you what those $3.8 billion can do for you as a competitor. That is a formidable opponent. I was dean of a College of Arts and Sciences, and we have a lot of bottlenecks in the educational process. One of them is we take freshmen in and we're supposed to teach them to write. And here's how we do it. We put them in sections of 20 to 24, and then they write 6 or 8 essays, 5 to 10 pages apiece, And we have instructors who grade them. And the hope is that the first essay gets graded before the second one has to be turned in so the students can learn. I tell you, we fail on that one many, many times. Well, Phoenix, if you're going to enroll 30,000 students a month, you can't hire enough competent writers to grade all those exams. That would be a real bottleneck. So they took a series of very experienced faculty in rhetoric and a bunch of computer programmers and got them together and started asking each other, how do you grade this? How do you grade this? And they iteratively went through this over and over and over again until such time that the computer program that they were working on could hit about 70% of what the very experienced graders could hit. And so they made a promise to their students. If you submit your essay by 11:59 p.m., we'll have it graded by 12:05 a.m. That's what $3.8 billion will do for you. When I heard this from a woman who was a vice president at Phoenix, I asked her what it would cost to buy it. I wanted that for the Fulbright College, and she said, you couldn't possibly afford it. And she was probably right. So I'm just saying this is what online technology can do if it makes sense. So what might the future look like? I'll just close so we can get on with our conversation. For a traditional institution that embraces some of the innovations that are before us. Well, I believe that a robust distance education program will become part of the institutional portfolio while maintaining the brand. Someone asked me recently on one of my campus visits, what hope is there if Phoenix can do all this? Well, the University of Arkansas means a great deal in the state of Arkansas. So does UCA, so does Arkansas Tech, so does Arkansas State. The brand means something. University of Texas means something. University of Michigan means something. And so we have the brand. We just have to embrace the technology to be able to utilize all that we have in order to serve our students. I think students are going to be either fully online, they may be fully seat-to-seat, or they're going to be in a hybrid of the two. In fact, hybrid is a term used to describe courses where technology is brought in to enhance the educational experience. So we must have a portfolio that has all of these, not one of these. And I think the institution that tries to just concentrate on one or the other is probably, unless they're a for-profit institution, will probably find themselves at the bottom of the competitive pack. We have actually looked at, in a seat-to-seat basis, the use of technology to sort of expand the capabilities of a fixed physical presence. As an example, one of the most expensive things that we build in institutions are laboratories. And our laboratories were saturated at UT Arlington. So we looked at the possibility of converting our traditional laboratory class into a class where we actually had two sections of laboratory meet in the same room at the same time. And we developed some of the experiments could be taught best using a technological platform, and some of them had to be taught in the laboratory where students got their hands dirty. And so you can sort of picture where this is going. Same laboratory, week one section meets, does an experiment where you have to get your hands dirty while the other group is on a computer. Next week it's reversed. And that way you can take this one physical plant and it sort of expand or double the number of students that one can serve. So there's a lot of opportunities like that. I only use that as an example to tell you that we need to be thinking very broadly in this. Online courses can be started at a variety of times during a year and offered in a variety of formats. I talked about 15-week semesters begun in August and ending in May. Well, it turns out we offer 5, 8, and 15-week semesters. We can offer them through synchronous or asynchronous delivery. There's no reason why a semester couldn't begin on the 15th of April or the 1st of October. There's nothing magical about it when we have it online. Students will be able to take courses in parallel. That's the traditional way that we do things. You know, you take 4 to 6 courses per semester, or they can do things sequentially. For working adults, for adult learners, sequential is really an advantage. You can concentrate from 5 weeks on this topic, you learn it very deeply, you move on to the next topic. Over a given period of time, that is 12 months, no longer are we fixed by this 9-month thing, you get the same number of credits in. It's just that you're doing it in a different format. Finally, alternative pricing structures may be envisioned to address a variety of possible approaches taken by students. And every time I think I've got all those approaches down on paper, students come up with one new creative way that I hadn't thought of. That's one of the beauties of students. So I think it's understood that some disciplines, you're probably sitting there thinking, well, some disciplines, maybe my discipline, it's just not going to be amenable to distance education. And you're probably right. The engineers have suggested that engineering cannot be taught this way. But I do have a cautionary tale. Just about the time someone says something can't be done, someone proves them wrong. And originally when this was sort of embraced by the educational community, people said, well, an MBA could never be earned online. And then the London School of Economics put their MBA online. And then North Carolina Chapel Hill, which is the top-rated public business school. And recently, University of Florida announced, and I think you're just going to see a lot of them. And there's others. I just picked several of them out. So every time we say something can't be done, someone proves us wrong. There's a chemistry course. Someone said, well, my own discipline, chemistry, can't be done online safely. Except at Harvard, they have a chemistry course for non-majors where you do all your experiments in the kitchen. Same chemical principles, you just get to eat your experiment. Okay? And biology at UT Arlington, they said it couldn't be done online, and the faculty proved them wrong. Turns out you can buy an attachment for an iPhone that's a 10-power microscope. Turns your iPhone into a microscope. And so I just caution you, every time someone says this can't be done, it's a challenge to people, a hill to climb, and they manage to climb it. Now, not to say that everything's perfect if we adopt this platform. I will tell you that because of what we're doing at UT Arlington, I receive death threats from registrars, the financial people, the accountants. You can sort of see, if you start a semester every month, there are all kinds of issues that we had to address. Believe it or not, we were long on our way to solving most of them. They can be solved. They're not easy, but they're not intractable. So scheduling, financial aid, student accounting, security is the person at the end of the wire who they say they are. And we have ways to sort of ensure that. So I just wanted to, first of all, leave you with a couple take-home points. I think the challenges that will be facing higher education over the next decade, they're real and significant, and we ignore them at our own peril, and we don't intend to do that. I think we can look at some other industry leaders who are no longer industry leaders, and it gives us a pretty good idea of what our fate will be if we don't meet the challenges. Technology, the good news is that the technology is available right now. It doesn't have to be invented to solve most of these problems if the educational environment will embrace it, and I think there's ample evidence that that is indeed occurring. And finally, the take-home message I want to leave with you is that I think these are very exciting times. Someone asked me, is this a bad time to get into administration higher education? I can't think of a better time to get into administration higher education. You know, there are really significant challenges to be overcome, and there's nothing worse than just treading water. I think our universities in this state, our colleges, abound with very clever, creative people. And I have no doubt that the University of Arkansas will rise to meet these challenges for the betterment of our students and, again, for our state. So I want to thank Dean Rutherford for this invitation and this opportunity to be with you here tonight. I want to thank you for your attention, and I encourage your comments and questions to further this conversation, because as you can tell, it's something that interests me greatly. Thank you very much.
All right, we do have time for questions. If you would raise your hand, and please wait until the microphone gets to you, and we'll open it up for questions. We're right up here, Craig. Bob will get you that microphone over.
To ensure a rich online experience, what is the university's responsibility to facilitate the build-out, the ongoing build-out of broadband, particularly in a rural state like this?
You know, I don't have enough information in terms of the cost of such a thing to kind of say what the university role should be. My thought, though, is that entrepreneurs and society in general have responded to economic challenges where there's a potential profit, and there's a lot to be had in the profit of this. I think the state's made some very significant investments in developing the optical fiber backbone that's now crisscrossing the state. And the fact that two-year colleges, et cetera, are being linked up to that I think bodes well for the ability to tie the entire state together through this. We have found, if you look at the other states which have similar rural populations, the private sector has got in and funded it quite readily because of, I look at my cable bill and UVerse every month, and so, you know, there's some money to be made there for individuals.
Governor?
I'm thrilled with what you're saying about higher education and very grateful that you're there to do that job.
Oh, thank you.
I'm deeply concerned about the raw material that arrives at your campus. This is a battle that the state has been fighting for many, many years, but there has to be some coming to grips with that, particularly if the university is going to be able to progress. I don't know what your dropout rates are for freshman year or before graduation. I suspect they're unacceptably high, especially now that we are funding so many of those either with lottery scholarship money or other scholarship money. But it is a huge loss to those families and the students, and it is a huge lost opportunity for the universities. You can't solve public education problems in a few words, but I would like your comments on that, please.
Thank you. I should have probably even mentioned this in my presentation. I think this is an area where some of these new technologies have a lot to say. One of the things that happens in a sequential course arrangement, as I mentioned, is that when individuals do not grasp a concept or grasp it at a level that's not going to support the rest of the semester, there's no opportunity to reinforce that learning. And you can understand why. The instructor is very busy, has a number of students in his or her charge, and can't possibly get constant feedback. The beauty of online, as I mentioned, is the feedback can be immediate and constant. I suggested that in my colleague Michael Moore's class. He knows how long each student spent on a particular module. If someone says, well, Dr. Moore, I don't know why I failed this module. I read all the material. He can go right in and say, well, actually, no, you didn't. And so the beauty of it is that there's ways to build loops into the system so that as individuals have problems, they go back or sent back to the appropriate part and review the material, develop competency, and then they move on. And I think my personal opinion is that developmental education, where we reiterate these concepts that probably should have been picked up in K through 12, is an area ripe for these types of technological improvements in the educational experience. We moved into an entry math level system, a commercial program that did exactly that. When a student made a mistake, the computer program, through experience, understood what they didn't understand, sent them back to the module where that concept was reinforced, and then allowed them to progress at their own pace. If you're coming in, you're an adult learner, you're coming back to school, you have some math phobias because it's been a long time, but really the skill set is there. It just needs the cobwebs to be knocked off. You can breeze through that material. Why 15 weeks? Let's do it in 3 weeks. On the other hand, an individual who needs more reinforcement can go back over. And in fact, if they don't feel comfortable, they can go back over and do the same module again and again. And you know, most folks who are lecturing don't like to go over and give the same lecture more than once. So I think that's an area, it's a good point, and I think it's an area where these technologies are going to create improvements for us.
Chancellor?
Boss.
No one believes that, Dan.
Yeah, I've got a question for you about interaction with the accreditors. You know, we've got a lot of things that are galvanized in higher education, and this whole what you're describing is advancement by mastery of concepts in a learner-centric way. In the health professions, we've got all these accrediting bodies that dictate an awful lot having to do with hours in the seat. And I just am interested in what kind of dialogue and conversation you envision to enable advancement on an individual basis of students as they master concepts.
Okay. First of all, the concept that Chancellor Rahn was talking about is one of competencies. Instead of our traditional way, once you master a competency, you move on. And in the state of Texas, we're actually looking about that in medical education. as a way to expedite it for some students. What I would say is that these technologies are not well understood by the accrediting boards at the present time, but they're becoming educated quite quickly. At UT Arlington, we were under SACS accreditation, Southern Associations of Colleges and Universities and Schools. And SACS is probably considered to be, I think, the most aggressive and maybe most conservative of the accrediting boards. And they really didn't understand what we were doing at first. But I will tell you, they sent in people who were willing to learn. And as a consequence of many conversations, they've become big supporters of it. In fact, Bell Whelan, who's the president of SACS, was president of one of our online conferences just very recently in Dallas. So I think it's going to take some time and some education on both parts, but as long as the quality is high and one can demonstrate that the outcomes are equivalent, the accreditors will come along.
Yes, we have a question right here. She's bringing you the microphone.
Dr. Bobbitt, thank you for those comments. It's really quite interesting, and I think it is the future of academia and tertiary education. My question is really about, with the massive expansion that the whole system, not just the U of A system, is experiencing through this. I'm Australian, obviously, from my accent, right? So that's been a big deal in the Australian system for a long time, and it really has created a lot of opportunity, but there's a lot of issues for the development of the faculty. We focus on the academic development and education of our students as the future, but the current circumstances often have, that some of the ones you're describing, can have a big impact on the quality of our faculty. How do we cross-train? How do we develop the skills of the faculty that might be a teacher at the medical school who's giving their lectures over and over and over to medical students and interacting at that level? How do we make sure that we can get more than 170 of those medical students getting that sort of education with the role of the faculty? How do you see the role of the faculty in that scenario?
One of the operating principles that we adhere to very, very strongly is we only want willing disciples. We found out it's much easier to pull people than push them. So for example, we faced this on the campus that I just left. A lot of skepticism, people feeling inadequately prepared, and some just downright hostile toward the whole concept. So what we did is we worked with the individuals who were willing. And no faculty member has the skill set to really create sort of the dynamic online environment that I just talked about. So you have to hire other individuals with skill sets to complement them. And what that means is we made sure that we had abundant designers. These are individuals who can take content. The faculty member is the content specialist, absolutely no doubt about it. Total control of content, course material, grading, standards, quality, the whole bit. That's the faculty member. But designers can take that and make it something that's very compelling. And we couple that with IT or technology people, because if you're bringing in links and you're bringing in other technologies, the worst thing you can do is to have these things break in the middle of an experience. And when we put that team together, the faculty member and the other individuals who are really supporters of the faculty member, we created some online courses that were very, very successful. And those successes caused others to consider. And they came in, and so we have a center for distance education, and they offer training. Sometimes it's just a one-hour conversation about, you want to get your feet wet, here's what to expect. And others get into it, jump into it in a much more formal sense, and eventually convert their course or courses to an online format. So I think the thing is that it can't be top-down. It must start with the faculty. And it has to be something that the faculty want to do because they see the advantages of it, or they're intrigued by the challenge. And I think when those conditions are met, then the experience becomes positive for everyone, including the students who will eventually take the course.
Senator Pryor.
Really a question to you, Skip, also. Governor Tucker has raised a fundamental issue in my mind, and that is the product that we send to the university and to all of our colleges and whatever. Every day, 7,000 kids are dropping out of high school, every day, across our country. they end up where I gave the graduation speech recently at the state prison at Cummings. Many of these do, and it's a sad, sad situation. I went to a national symposium, Skip, last week in St. Louis, sponsored by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, looking at this particular issue and how we can deal with it. General Colin Powell is involved with it. Aren't we having such a symposium here? Is it AE10? AE10 is sponsoring, Skip? Where is that?
It's not AE10's doing it,
Oh.
it's not us.
Oh,
I think they're doing it.
is it going to be in this Sturgis Hall, or do we know? Does Nikolai know? Okay, anyway. It's a huge issue, and Governor Tucker has really put his finger on something, and that's the product that we send you in remedial education and all the millions we're spending there. Just to accept the ones that do get to college and want to go to college. So it's a tough one.
Got a question over here, and then
Great insights. John Cotter, Harvard business professor, one of his last books was called A Sense of Urgency, and he studied major change initiatives in corporations, organizations, and in communities. And the number one factor that he found for those 10% that exceeded expectations were that they were able to create a sense of urgency throughout the organization and among the stakeholders. Could you comment on that if you agree, and what would you see are the basis for creating a sense of urgency for a robust higher education system in Arkansas?
Well, you know, Andy Grove at Intel had a little bit of an advantage. Every year, Andy would fire 10% of all of his employees and then hire 10% new employees. And the private sector operates with a different set of environment, or in a different environment than the collegial attitudes that persist in educational establishments. I think the sense of urgency has to come from the faculty themselves, and a willingness to understand both the limitations of what's going on right now and a willingness to change, to adapt to the students. Because as I mentioned before, I can't imagine this being top down and being highly significant. I do think conversations like this are a very important starting point. We have to have this conversation. I'm visiting most of the institutions. On every campus I've been on, we talk about this with the faculty. And you can see that, you know, there are some who clearly are not ready for the idea. There's some who are quite ready and some who are contemplating it. I think that's a great start, a great start. I think that you will see that across the United States, the private sector tends to lead. They're sort of a bellwether of what's coming. And if you go back just 2 years, at the height, really just coming out of the recession, there were only 2 successful IPOs in the United States. Believe it or not, both of them involved for-profit educational institutions. I believe, if I remember correctly, one went for $900 million and one for $1.1 billion. That's a sense of urgency. The private sector understands the risks and potential rewards in this endeavor, and will be pushing us to compete with them. And we can compete very, very well. We have the brand, we have the product, we have the faculty.
Francis, do you have a question?
I just wanted to say, Governor Tucker and Senator Pryor, what they mentioned, I think you brought out in what you were saying tonight, and that is that we need to change from within. And when you said we don't need to, you know, who says we need to start in August and end in or September and in August or whenever, you know, they have proven that the young children should go to school year round. And I think a lot of the things that you have said about, you know, let them work on one subject till they get that good and then move on to the next one. I think that we need to start with the young people doing the same things you were talking about here. And that, I mean, that's not your problem, but that's what I think, you know, what you're saying is what they need to do in the grade schools, and they know it, and they need to start earlier, they need to start younger, and I think we need to change our whole school system. That's what we need to do.
Let's be on this talk.
Yes, sir, we have a question right back here. Yes, sir.
Good evening, Dr. Bobbitt. How do you, I'm going to shift a little bit, it's good to take everybody along. I know we're planning for the future. How are we going to be able to reach the minority community? There are a lot of issues that deal with diversity in the state. The minority community seems to be overlooked in many areas. For instance, I'm going to give you an example. We have at the UMS, we have issues that deal with diversity where some students, as well as staff, have faced situations of racism and discrimination. They have not received proper attention. There has been issues in which those that you're supposed to report to have not taken any action. How are you, as the new system president, going to deal with some of these issues where people do not cover up for those higher up, and also to make sure that all minorities, as well as others, receive equal protection under the law? Thank you.
Okay. Well, there's no online equivalent to answer your question, but let me just say that I think that each of the campuses, from what I've seen so far in my 10 days, have excellent leadership and are sensitive to the issues that confront all of our students and indeed our faculty and staff. There are mechanisms that are in place when I look at the policies and procedures on each campus where people have redress if they feel that there is a problem. And unless someone feels that the redress policies have not addressed a particular concern and it comes to me, my perception is it can be and is being handled very well on the individual campuses.
Final question here, Jerry.
Economic development has crept into one of the mantras of higher ed, and those of us that are involved in innovation and really focused on university innovation and the speed at which we can get it out of the institution into some commercialized job-creating framework. Could you comment a little bit about your either experience with that continuum or your sense of priority about that?
Well, when I was talking about the advantages that accrue having institutions and an educated workforce, one of the things I like to do frequently is look at sort of the best case examples. And if you look at the Stanford School of Engineering, just to see what a university can mean to an area like the Bay Area, there's a few companies that have been started by the faculty there. I looked it up. It's Google, Amgen, Yahoo. You could sort of Genentech. You can kind of run through a who's who of the top 500 in biotech or information technology. If you move over to the East Coast and look at the Boston corridor, the graduates and faculty at MIT have created over 4,300 companies over the past 20 years. And I think if I remember correctly, the number, their net economic impact was somewhere around $230 billion. Those are pretty compelling statistics to drive the process here in the state of Arkansas. And, I think it's clear that most of the jobs, new jobs that are being created, are not being created in large companies, which tend to be a little bit more conservative in how they expand and contract, but really new companies. And so I think the universities in the state can be the economic engine that drives that process. Most states have adopted tax structures and other sort of enticements to help young entrepreneurs and new entrepreneurs get acclimated into the process and be successful.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a round of applause to new president, Dr. Don Bobbitt. And for those of you that didn't get your questions answered, please come up and visit with Dr. Bobbitt before he leaves. Thank you all for being here. Have a safe trip home.